It's all good.
Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. The Higgs Boson has been found. Mind blown. This week in Science. Coming up next.
I've got the kind of mind I can't get enough. I want to learn everything. I want to fill it all up with new discoveries that happen every day of the week. There's only one place to go to find the knowledge I seek. I want to know what's happening. What's happening? What's happening this week in science? What's happening? What's happening? What's happening this week in science?
Good science to you, Kirsten and Blair.
Good science to you, Justin. How's it going there, Mr. Pneumonia Man?
Awesome. Modern miracles of science continue to function throughout my body, keeping me from dying. It's
That's
really
wonderful.
cool. I love science.
It's great when you can actually go, hey, science is what is keeping me healthy right now.
Yeah, no, I think if you get it would, in the olden days, it would be called the vapors, and the hacking cough would turn into full-blown pneumonia, and I would be dead within like a month. So I would drown on liquid forming in my lungs. It would be really awful. And instead, I walked into a doctor. He listened to my lungs and went, "Oh, let me write this down on a piece of paper, and it's basically a you will live pass. There you go. Yeah, enjoy. Yeah, it's going to be $10 at Rite Aid." Yeah.
Incidentally, I think that's the worst superhero ever. Pneumonia Man.
I think I tend to agree with you on that one. Yeah.
Unless he was resistant to pneumonia, in which case he'd make a very good doctor in third world countries.
All right.
How are you doing, Kirsten? What have you been up to?
All sorts of stuff. All sorts of stuff. I've been here, there, everywhere, but I'm at home now. It's good. Taking care of my kid. Had the 4th of July. It was very sciencey, full of fireworks, gunpowder, that kind of stuff. Exciting times. Exciting times. But I have a whole bunch of science stories because this 4th of July, it's a national holiday. It's a national holiday here in the United States. United States national holiday. That doesn't mean it's a holiday everywhere else. And so
But from this
scientists
day forward, Independence Day will be celebrated throughout the world.
No, that's not where I was going. That's not where I was going. I was just saying that I thought it was interesting that on our holiday, we had some big science news that broke with a press conference in CERN, Switzerland. Because, like I said, it's not a national holiday other places, and so they can have press conferences and tell the world about all the science that they want and go, U.S., you could have built a super collider and had your big press conference, but you didn't. So this is ours. And we're going to have our press conference on your holiday when all of the reporters want to be on vacation and all the scientists want to be.
Wow, you really
on
think it
vacation.
was that spiteful? I don't think so.
I don't think so. It had a lot to do with it being
Finding the Higgs boson.
Yeah, and
That
it being
probably
the
was a
first
very
day
big part of it.
big conference also that a lot of physicists were going to. So the big news this week is Higgs boson news, and we are going to jump into that right away. But additionally, what other stories do we have to dig into? I have some dark matter news that I would like to get into at some point today, and maybe some bad news for coral reefs. Blair, what'd you bring?
I brought a story about bees and how we can trick them into being younger.
Ooh, you brought that story?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Love that story. Justin, what did you bring to talk about?
I've got 2 types of diabetes stories, but they're not type 2 diabetes stories. And I have an incredibly big mystery that has just been observed by astronomers, something that they have no answer for. This is going to be something very intriguing. Not as perhaps immediate big news as the Higgs boson, but this is something much bigger and represents a mystery that we're going to be probably pursuing for some time to come.
Interesting. We like mysteries here. We like talking about things that we can end up talking about for much longer. Here, I'm moving my camera a little bit so that there's Blair.
I'm here, I
If you're
swear.
watching on the video, there's Blair. Exactly. So let's jump into the Higgs boson news. So at the top of the show, Justin had the shortest disclaimer ever, which he disclaimed would be the shortest disclaimer ever.
Although I
So
have to make a little disclaimer to that.
meta disclaimer.
Some of the audience members claim that there's a shorter disclaimer in our history. That wasn't actually the shortest disclaimer. That's just a disclaimer for the disclaimer being the shortest disclaimer.
All right, as we dig into this onion even further. So the disclaimer said, "Hey, we found the Higgs boson." But did we really?
Did we really?
Did we really? This is my question. Did we really? And the truth is that we don't know. We do not know whether or not we have physicists, not we. It's as if we're like, yay, somebody else found it, but I'm going to accept this as my own victory. No, physicists at the LHC with the ATLAS and CMS experiments have discovered a particle. So is that particle the Higgs boson? Maybe. It fits an energetic profile that could be the Higgs boson. They say it is a boson or boson, if you want a boson. It is a particle. That's what they know.
A particle has been discovered. So it must be the Higgs boson. Woo! Higgs boson has been discovered.
It's jumping.
They found a particle.
A little
There's
bit.
a particle there. It wasn't discovered before. Higgs boson!
Aren't you like all about no Higgs boson being discovered this year? Wasn't that your whole big thing? No.
That's been my thing every year. But now they've discovered the Higgs boson has been found.
No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't.
What?
It's going to keep
You're
going.
telling me I'm right? You can't tell me I'm right.
I
There's
know,
no way.
right? A particle, which can be described as a boson, is in the mass region of around 125 to 126 giga electron volts, which we have reported previously on this show as being the range in which the physicists have been narrowing their search for this particle. And so they've got all this data from particle collisions. They're smashing things together at harder and harder velocities, and smaller and smaller little pieces, little particles are breaking off. And so they measure the little particles that break off. And then from what they detect in their detectors, the stuff that gets scattered, they infer what is actually the source of the particles. And so they are getting rid of certain energy ranges. They are narrowing it down. There are experiments that are going to be looking at the spin state of this particle. So is it a 0, 1, or 2 spin in a 0, 1, or 2 spin state? They think from everything so far, it looks as though it's a 0 spin state, which would be what the Higgs boson should be. So that seems to be okay, but there's still more data to be collected. On reddit.com, there are actually a couple of physicists who are working on this project, and both of them in the comment section on the Reddit conversation, they pretty much said, yeah, this looks like this particle. We think it's going to be this particle. Everyone's excited because this is probably it, but we have a lot more to be looking at. So the press release from CERN is really interesting. There's a quote from the CERN director. It says, "The discovery of a particle consistent with the Higgs boson opens the way to more detailed studies requiring larger statistics, which will pin down the new particle's properties and is likely to shed light on other mysteries of our universe." And so what he's getting at there is, as we get closer to it, us identifying it as the Higgs boson, then, we'll get more. It's more and more accuracy and more precision and less error in the determination of what this particle is. So there's interesting aspects that can be determined as we pin down, verify that this is indeed the Higgs boson, or that it is just another boson that was unexpected. And so if it's not the Higgs boson, but it's another boson, then we have really interesting questions to start asking, because then we're like, okay, where's the Higgs?
Well, the first question we'll have to answer is then what to call this particle, right? Because then there's going to be this is going to be the prolonged debate, is because there's going to be people really lobbying for this is the Higgs boson. We don't know what the properties are, but we found something. It's the Higgs boson. That's what we were looking for. So it must be that. Or even though we're not going to completely go out on that limb and say it's the Higgs boson, we found the Higgs boson. So now, while studying it, there's going to be this sort of nether time between this discovery and actually identifying the properties, where it becomes either more Higgs boson-ish or less Higgs boson-y. And in that period of time, people will start lobbying to name it something other than the Higgs boson, so the search for the Higgs boson could continue. And in that time, there'll be those who are like, no, we need to keep studying it. It's going to eventually be the Higgs boson. And others who will be calling it the something else boson. It's going to be this weird, strange, because if this had just been discovered, and they weren't actually trying to nail down the Higgs boson, it would get some working name, right? And then we'd figure out what its properties are. And that would be the properties of that previously named boson. But this is a boson that has a name before it was discovered. It has properties. It has things it has to do and accomplish. All these expectations before it's been discovered. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they either walk away from that if it doesn't turn out to have the properties that the Higgs was supposed to, or if they call it the Higgs, even if it doesn't do what the Higgs boson was, and later find what would have been the Higgs boson, but have to name it something else.
Yeah, but it's not just the naming that is the crazy thing. I mean, it's the whole idea of, if there's this particle that was not predicted that they've found, what does that mean for the standard model? So far, we have a bunch of particles that are basically predicted by the standard model, that we have 12 energy fields. And each of those energy fields ends up, the activity within the energy field ends up being represented in our universe by a particle. And so there are particles, the Higgs field is this 12th and final field that we have not identified the particle for. And so we've got particles for every other field of the other 11 fields that are predicted. The Higgs particle is the very last one for the standard model that we need. And so if this is not the Higgs, it's like, okay, well, what is it? And what does that mean for the standard model? Does that mean that the standard model is slightly wrong, that it needs to be adjusted in some way? Which is interesting in its own right scientifically. If indeed it is the Higgs, it's pretty cool because it verifies the standard model of physics that we've been working from. And we can kind of move forward and say, okay, now we know that that the standard model of physics is right for all intents and purposes. And now we can investigate it further and try and develop further technologies and physical models based on what we know works within the standard model. So it's really interesting. So the Higgs boson is this particle that's supposed to give mass to matter. So all the other particles in the 11 other energy fields, they don't have any mass until they interact with the Higgs field. And so the Higgs field then interacts with a particle, say a quark or a gluon, and interacts and creates Higgs bosons that drag down, that give mass to those little tiny matter-making particles. It's a kind of a crazy idea when you really think about it. And I honestly, I don't know how it all really works, but it's kind of a fun idea. There's a bunch of stories running around right now online, people talking about different analogies for explaining the Higgs boson effect of the Higgs field. And the most popular one, of course, is a Justin Bieber analogy that basically is related to famous people. When famous people walk through a crowded room, they attract people around them, and that makes them have inertia. So they can't slow down because if they do slow down, they'll have a hard time speeding back up. So they have to kind of keep their momentum going. Whereas nobodies who don't know, who nobody knows, you can go through a room without ever being spoken to, just like a photon of light with no mass does. So actually not a photon, like a neutrino does. Sorry about that. So it's just a funny analogy. And I just love, like, Justin, you've come up with analogies over the years, and I don't know, I was reading through some of the analogies that people have come up with, and they made me cringe a bit.
Yeah.
Like,
A bad analogy in science, especially this sort of science, especially quantum physics stuff, you have to have analogies. Otherwise, it's, you have to have a PhD in complex numbers to fully understand the intricacies. So you come up with an analogy that can make even the layman, which is what I am, somewhat comfortable with understanding the universe around them. But a bad analogy, you throw a bad analogy out there and it sticks in people's head and it just messes with them.
It does mess with them, and it changes the way that they understand things. So anyway, long story short, really exciting news about the Higgs.
They discovered the Higgs boson, and I'm going to stick with this because here's the thing. I've decided that this is the Higgs boson. This is the missing particle that they were looking for, and they should call it the Higgs boson and stick with it. But I don't believe ultimately it will be responsible for giving mass to the rest of particle physics. I'm resting on that. I will call it the Higgs boson. I will acknowledge the Higgs boson was discovered. But until they can prove to me that it does what they say it does, which is really the most incredible part of the whole thing, I'm still sticking over in my skeptical corner.
Mm-hmm. I think it's good to be skeptical. I don't think that they're going. I don't think that there are many scientists who are actually saying we found the Higgs boson, because not all the data is in yet. I mean, I don't know. There is still room for it to not be the Higgs.
I was reading that Hawking said he's lost his $100 bet. But at the very end of it, he's also like, let me see if at the very end of, like, saying for good reason, I bet Gordon Kane, Michigan University, the Higgs particle wouldn't be found. It seems I have just lost $100. It seems. So maybe he's still holding out a little further. Although he is still saying that Peter Higgs should earn a Nobel Prize off of this.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We will see what happens. This is a press conference. This is a keynote talk at the beginning of a conference. It's not a published paper, so there's still a paper there's more data that has to be analyzed. And like I said, there are multiple experiments. I'm just within the CMS experiments, there are instruments that all the data hasn't even been analyzed from those yet. And
Sure. But Kirsten, this is as close as you can come to categorically proving something.
Yes, I'm not
without actually having proven something. Which is why there's so much interest in it.
I'm like over it. It's a circus. You just let circuses and ponies.
But I love circuses. We need another ring. Let's get somebody up on the high wire act while somebody's juggling flaming machetes. Wow. Standing, balancing precariously in the back of a pony. It's jumping over lion cages. It's
about people are doing a Google search to see what the Higgs boson is, who didn't know what it was before because it's in the news, which I think, if nothing else, if it's getting to people to learn things that they didn't know before, that's kind of a win-win situation.
I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree. And if you do want a laugh, there is a fun video out of Brooklyn hipsters being asked what the Higgs boson is. And it's a video.
Here's the problem, though. Here's the potential drawback of this. I mean, a real one when we're talking about other forms of science that are having immediate impacts on policy. And especially the United States, around the world, things like global warming, things like stem cells. If it turns out that they can make an announcement later that this wasn't what they expected it to be after the hubbub, science just can be flawed. Now, you and I understand this. We understand that science is about figuring stuff out, and you're wrong more times than you're right, but it's the times you're right that are really important because they move science forward. I would hate to see this used as something against science if the Higgs boson turns out not to do what it says, what everybody thinks it does, if this turns out not to be the Higgs, if there was some sort of flaw in the analysis, anything like that. So even if it turns out not to be the Higgs, I say we all pretend it was. Because I think the ramifications are worse if we don't.
Blah, 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 blah. And this is where I think we're moving on to another subject. The Justin sock puppet and his ramifications. Justin, what else did you bring to talk about today? You have some good stories. Mysteries?
All right. This is a somewhat astonishing bit of news from astronomers. They're reporting a baffling. Astronomers are being baffled at this discovery. Has never been seen before. There is an extraordinary. When I say extraordinary, I don't mean your average run-of-the-mill extraordinary. This is an extraordinary amount of dust around a nearby star that has mysteriously disappeared. Now, this is extraordinary. This is I'm going to just read some quotes because this is the only way to do this. It's like the classic magician's trick. Now you see it, now you don't, says Carl Mellis, postdoctoral scholar, UC San Diego, lead author of the research. Only in this case, we're talking about enough dust to fill an inner solar system. And it's really gone. It's not there anymore. It's as if the rings around Saturn had disappeared, said co-author Benjamin Zuckerman, a UCLA professor of physics and astronomy. But even more shocking because the dusty disk of rocky debris was bigger and much more massive than Saturn's rings. The disk around this star, if it were in our solar system, would have extended from the sun halfway to our Earth. Which occurred around a star some 450 light years from Earth in the direction of the constellation Centaurus, if you're looking for it, appeared July 5th in the journal Science, which is today. So that's really breaking news. Perplexing thing about this discovery is that we don't have a satisfactory explanation to address what happened around the star. Basically, they don't even know and they don't even have an explanation for why it happened or how it could have happened. There's no rational way this could have happened. The disappearing act appears to be independent of the star itself. There is no evidence to suggest that the star zapped the dust with some sort of mega flare or any other violent event. Mellis described the star, designated TWiS C82412652, as a young analog of our own sun that only a few years ago displayed all the characteristics of hosting a solar system in the making. This is before the transition has completely taken place into planets. You still have the dust disk floating out there before it sort of separated out into little orbs of rocky mass with either life or no life on it. Now, very little of the warm, dusty material thought to originate from collisions of rocky planets is apparent. Nothing like this has ever been seen in the many hundreds of stars astronomers have studied for dust rings. Zuckerman says, this disappearance is remarkably fast, even on human timescales. Never mind the astronomical timescale. So astronomical timescale, things can change over the, thousands and millions and billions of years. But this happened quickly within our observational history of it. The dust disappearance at the star was so bizarre and so quick. Initially, I figured that our observations must simply be wrong in some strange way. Norm Murray, director of Canadian Institute for Theoretical Astrophysics, who was not part of the research group, says, the history of astronomy has shown that events that are not predicted and hard to explain can be game changers. The dust had been present around the star since at least 1983 because nobody had observed the star in the infrared before then. It continued to grow brightly in the infrared for 25 years. In 2009, it did start to dim. By 2010, the dust emission was gone. So that's a year It took a year. The astronomers observed the star twice that year from Gemini Observatory in Chile, 6 months apart. An infrared image obtained by the Gemini telescope as recently as May 1st of this year confirmed the warm dust had now been gone for 2.5 years. Like Earth, warm dust absorbs the energy of sunlight and re-radiates that heat. Energy is infrared radiation. Interesting. So, because so much dust has been orbiting around the star, planets are very likely forming there, said Zuckerman, whose research is funded by NASA. The lack of an existing model for what is going on around the star is forcing astronomers to rethink what happens when young solar systems are in the making. The dust likely resulted from a violent collision, but that would not explain where it went. Was it somehow swallowed by the star?
Maybe it was. I mean, isn't that part of, or maybe it was, maybe there's a lot of heat there? I mean, did you say that the infrared signature changed at all? Like maybe it
dimmed a little, 2010.
Yeah.
Although they didn't see any like sort of uptick from the star itself in terms of like having put out more energy that would explain like going out and incinerating everything. I mean, if it goes out as far as Mercury, I guess it's only got to bring like in our solar system one planet in. If there's nothing out further to maybe counterweight that planet. Kind of makes sense, I guess. But it says here, for going further, although we've identified a couple of mechanisms that are potentially viable, none are really compelling. Miller says, in one case, gas produced in the impact that released the dust helps to quickly drag the dust particles into the star and thus to their doom. Another possibility, collisions of large rocks left over from an original major impact provide a fresh infusion of dust particles into the disk, which then instigate a runaway process where small grains chip into oblivion, both themselves and also larger grains. Meh. Major dust regions are known to exist in our own solar system and include the asteroid belt between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, another located beyond the orbit of Neptune. Nearly 30 years ago, NASA's infrared astronomical satellite IRIS first discovered many similar regions orbiting other stars, but none of them having disappearing acts like the one we just seen.
Right. Yeah, it's
the
it's the big question. There's dust around all sorts of stars, around all sorts of planets, and where did this dust go? Was it just mismeasured initially, or was this really, something that some kind of force or heating or something that just vaporized it?
Yeah, I mean they had it monitored for 25 years in which it was getting brighter. So the dust cloud was collecting energy over that 25 years. It's hard to say it was mismeasured if they had that long to observe it. But there is definitely a mystery here. Definitely there is. We know from at least past evidence of being on the planet that there will be an answer. There's a solution. There is something to learn from this. Right. There are very few mysteries in science that are the result of poor writing, like the trick ending of a bad movie that doesn't really work. There's going to be a reason. There's a backstory to this. There's more information to be gleaned.
And the thing is that this is not a cliffhanger. Like science doesn't just finish a season and then get canceled, like so many great programs on TV networks. That doesn't happen. Science, there are more questions. There's no cancellation, and science moves on. That's right. You're listening to This Week in Science, otherwise known as TWiS. And Blair, what'd you bring for your science Animal Corner?
Blair's Animal Corner. She works at a zoo, likes hippos, isn't fond of pandas.
Love how that's become part of my identity now. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I brought a story about bees. There's been lots of bee news lately. They're doing lots of interesting things with bees. And now we've learned that bees' brains are pretty plastic, that they can adjust in different ways. And so the new study says that they can actually turn back time and reverse brain aging by acting like younger bees.
I love this story.
Yeah. So
What do you mean acting like younger bees?
they found that bees in the hive, their brain was pretty much optimal and working perfectly well until they left the hive. And then in just a couple of weeks, their body and their brain was just ravaged and they did not last much longer. So what they did is they wanted to actually be able to manipulate that and see if the attitudes and the jobs that the bees did that normally is based on the age of the bee could actually affect brain function.
Mm-hmm.
So they took a hive. This is really funny. And they took all of the young bees out of the hive. Young bees are essentially nurses. They take care of the larvae in the honeycomb and they feed them and keep everything nice and tidy in there.
Mm-hmm.
Little nurse bees. They took all of the young nurse bees away. They left only queen, larva. And so when the bees that were out looking for food came home to find all the nurse bees gone,
What do we do?
they took over the nurse job. And
Like coming
they
home to
found
no babysitter.
that after 10 days, 50% of the older bees caring for the nest and larva had significantly improved their ability to learn new things.
Huh?
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then beyond this, I love this, that they actually took it the next step forward. They didn't just release
Not
this
just the
and go,
behavior.
oh, this is what we saw.
Yeah.
They actually looked inside these bees' brains and they found that 2 proteins changed in the bees that took up the nursing behavior. They found PRX6, which is also a protein that is found in human brains that protects against dementia, including dementia related to Alzheimer's. And they also discovered a second, what they call a chaperone protein that protects other proteins from being damaged when the brain or other tissues are exposed to cell level stress. So not only did they see this actual change where bees could learn better and they really appeared to kind of heal their brain when they changed back to this younger lifestyle, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
They actually had a chemical change in their brain. Their brain function did heal itself. And so now they're just itching to try this on some mammals. They want to try it on some rats to see if changing the activities of the rats can change their brain function.
Right. Getting them to do things that young animals do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's one thing to, put a drug out on the market after years and years of testing on all these different animal species, and then in the end it may or may not work. But they're saying that they can actually make a social change in people with brain issues.
What do teenagers do these days?
I know,
All right,
that's what
Grandma,
I was wondering.
We're taking away your phone. Okay?
Uh-huh.
We're taking away there's no more ability to dial a number. From now on, you have to text. You're going to be on texting only. So that's the only way you can talk to your grandkids, your family. You need to text them. If you can't do that, too bad. This is for your own good.
I was thinking the other one. I was thinking about jobs, since that's what they were talking about here. I was wondering, okay, are we going to give old people a paper route?
They have to go work
and make
at
them mow the
McDonald's.
lawn?
Yeah, go mow the lawn. Exactly.
Yeah.
You give them, or they get a car and they have to go
Fantastic.
cruise the main drag or the mall.
For any kids who are out there listening, this is the perfect way to get out of chores. Look, there's a scientific study that it's for your own benefit that you do the dishes, you mow the lawn, you take out the trash. I'm thinking of you by not doing these things.
I was
I'm
even
already
wondering,
young.
Right.
we send the people who are showing signs of dementia back to school,
Go to school. That's good.
which could all come back down to using parts of your brain that maybe you're not using.
Well, that's something that comes up over and over again in aging research. I remember when I was doing research related to aging, it was just this motto of use it or lose it.
Mhm.
And we know for a fact that if you do not use certain skills, certain things in your brain related to sociality. So that's another part of this.
Right.
Instead of being off and foraging, they're being social and having to deal with other insects in the hive. So sociality. If you're not social, your brain withers and neurons die. You know, the pruning, they just stop. The little tree gets sad in your brain. You know, it's just about anything. And it's, you know, maybe crossword puzzles will help, but it's really getting out and doing things, continuing to stimulate your brain, reading, not just reading, but thinking about what you've read, talking to other people about what you've read, getting out and interacting and exercising. You know, there are all the different things that we can think of what our brain allows us to do. And if you just stop doing anything, you're gonna lose.
Right.
That
and there's impediments to that, though. I mean, it's hard to physically get out there in the world at times, and you know, especially if your eyesight is failing, it's very difficult to read books. Although I suppose you could listen to books on audiobooks of some sort and be able to maintain your mental plasticity that way.
Yep.
What would be really neat is if we could find a way to measure these proteins that they looked at in people that are, you know, I don't know. Can they look at it if you're alive? You have to cut open the brain, don't you?
That's one of the big problems
It's
with
the hard way.
related to stuff going on in the brain, because you can't have a before and after without invasively going into the brain to take a sample of tissue and find out what happened. And I don't know many people who are going to be like, yeah, sure, just, you know, stick something in my head and
it's everybody's brain after they died, and you could look at what their activities were in their old age and look at the amount of these proteins.
And research needs more brains. I'm going to say that. So if you haven't thought about it, consider donating your brain to science.
All right. Hey, you've talked me into it. I think that would be fine.
Exactly. Keep a good ledger of your daily activities. And
I'm going to start wearing a helmet everywhere I go to protect my brain for science later.
This is for science.
Data.
That's right. You know what? I think it's time that we come to the end of the first half of This Week in Science. I have to get to, but you know, we'll get to it in the second half. We got to get to it. So much more science. So everyone stay tuned. We'll be back after just a few messages. And this is where I say something like TWiS would really like to thank Audible.com for sponsoring this hour of This Week in Science. Audible.com is the leading provider of audiobooks online and off, with over 100,000 different titles in their library. TWiS is certain that you will actually be able to find something to enjoy, something to treat your ears with, because that's what you do. You just sit back, listen, enjoy. Wherever you are, you can learn. Maybe this is a great way to stimulate your brain, right? And you can get a free trial by just today. Start right now. Go to audiblepodcast.com/TWiS, TWIS. That's audiblepodcast.com/TWiS. Get a free audiobook download of your choice. Stimulate your brain. Fight aging with TWiS and audible.com right now. TWiS also has merchandise that you might enjoy, so head over to twis.org, which is our website, TWIS.org, to go check out what we've got to offer. We have CDs. The This Week in Science music compilation CD is available still. We have a few more copies left here in this box under my desk. And additionally, we have T-shirts, the World Robot Domination T-shirts that you can get for a mere pittance. And, wear the t-shirt, support your future robot overlords, let them know that you're on their side. So when they do come and dominate, they're not going to take you out. You have a flag for protection, thanks to TWiS. Additionally, TWiS is supported by listeners like you. Your donations pay for our hosting, bandwidth, contractors we need to hire, fun things we try to do for the show, and we really appreciate anything that you're able to give. And a lot of people have recently been donating with the news that we are no longer going to be on Twit and have to kind of figure out a new path through the internet world to get TWiS to you. Help keep TWiS on the air. Help out. Make a donation. You make this show possible, and you can hit that PayPal donation button that's at the bottom of each show page on the website, twis.org. Go there, listen to the most recent episode, comment, make a donation, hit one of those little pink buttons. We've made it really easy. We thank you for your support. We really couldn't do it without you.
Lie somewhere within this scatter plot. Our first assumptions were correct. Disprove the rest. It's hard. The methods and hypothesis and patience are the only things I need. Put on a pair of goggles and go looking for the things I couldn't see.
And we're back with more This Week in Science.
That's right. And we've got lots more science. I got a story for you. You want to hear about worms or the end of coral reefs?
Bring it.
Okay, so I think I'm going to do the happy news first and hope that I can get to the depressing news in a few minutes, But anyway, really cool worms. Story written by Ed Yong on his Not Exactly Rocket Science blog about some really interesting worms that vomit glowing bacteria. I mean,
we perked up.
We call it vomit, but they extrude. Anyway, they use this bacteria. These worms are called Heterorhabditis bacteriophora. Wonderful little worms that are used by gardeners. And that image, I don't think is one of those worms. That looks like a wax moth larva. I don't know. The image on the screen, I don't know if it matches up with the actual worm that we're talking about. But anyway, moving on. This microscopic creature, it's a very tiny, tiny worm. Not the kind of worm that you'd normally see in the garden, but gardeners use them, add them to soil to control garden pests. So the insect pests that come into the garden, the little tiny microscopic worms will bite them and try and infect them, and they vomit out. I mean, that's the best word that I can use. A bacterium that's called Photorhabdus luminescens. And Photorhabdus luminescens has a wonderful glow to it. It luminesces. And for a really interesting note that Ed Yong came up with, in the U.S. Civil War, soldiers were sometimes contaminated with these bacterium, and it gave the wounds a mysterious blue shine. And they called them the angel's glow because it protected them from blood poisoning. So really interesting side effect of being infected by these bacteria if you have a wound. But to an insect, it can be deadly because these bacteria switch. They have two forms. They have a form that can live happily inside the worm without bothering the worm at all, which is called the M form. And then they have another form, which is really toxic to bacteria. It produces lots of toxins. It emits all these toxins, and the insects that are their hosts end up dying. So they have this M form in the worm, and they have the P form in the insects. Nice form for worm, bad form for insects. It turns out that there's a switch, a very simple switch on these bacteria. It's called the MAD switch, which I think is a really funny name. And this little piece of DNA actually is a promoter sequence of DNA. If it's turned off, there's no gene copying that's promoted. So that's what a promoter sequence does. And when it's turned on, it leads to the transcription and translation of a sequence of DNA, which leads to the toxic byproducts that are bad for insects. So they found that this MAD switch is just a randomly turned on or off switch. There's no real rhyme or reason to what turns it on or off. And so the researchers trying to figure out how or what causes this this bacterial species to live so well inside the worm and to cause such a terrible effect on insects. They found that it's actually just environmental randomness, stochasticity, that leads to one form, the M form, existing and surviving inside of the worm really well. And then the P form, the toxic form, being really, really competitive inside of the insect. And so it's just a random switch, really. That there's nothing driving it. So the M form live in the worm, and then they get vomited out into, and there's a number of P forms that are in existence there also, side by side with the M form, but they've never really been noticed before. All of them get vomited out. The M form don't do anything inside of the insects. The P form then cause all sorts of trouble. So it's just wherever they are, one form happens to be more dominant and have a more dominant effect than the other. It's kind of interesting, but it's just a little bacterium vomited out like by a worm that kills insects. It's great story. Where's Justin? What's going on over there?
Hey, this is a good story. I've got a couple of diabetes stories, which wasn't meant to be themed, but apparently that's what happened. The first one is, what doesn't kill you makes you smarter? At least that seems to be the case if you have diabetes and have been treating it with the drug metformin. Because according to recent research, which I have just misplaced, according to recent research, it actually makes new brain cells grow. Huh? Discovery is an important step towards therapies that aim to repair the brain, not by introducing new stem cells, but rather by spurring those that are already present into action, says the study's lead author, Frida Miller, of the Hospital for Sick Children, which I think is Canadian. The fact that it's a drug that is so widely used and proven to be safe makes this news all the better. Earlier work by Miller's team highlighted a pathway known as a CBP for its essential role in telling neural stem cells where and when to differentiate into mature neurons. As it happens, others have discovered this in the past, that the same pathway is important for the metabolic effects of the drug metformin, but this was taking place not in the brain, but in liver cells. We put two and two together, Miller says. If metformin activates CBP pathways in the liver, they thought, maybe it could also be doing that in neural stem cells of the brain, encouraging brain repair. So the new evidence lends support to that promising idea in both mouse brains and human brain cells, making metformin the mice taking metformin not only showed an increase in the birth of new neurons, but they were also better able to learn the location of a hidden platform in a standard maze test of spatial learning, which is, I think they put mice in water and figure out how quickly they can figure out where a little submerged platform that allows them to stand on and not have to swim anymore goes. So while it remains to be seen whether the very popular diabetes drug might already be serving as a brain booster for those who are now taking it, there is some correlative, circumstantial, not really the point of a study. So all the potential non-conforming articles of data weren't exactly analyzed. But there are hints that it may have cognitive effects for people with Alzheimer's disease, because it has been thought previously that this drug being used on patients with Alzheimer's and diabetes, it was shown to have a positive effect on the Alzheimer's, but the idea previously had been somehow diabetes was lending itself to the onset of the Alzheimer's. And therefore, by controlling the diabetes, you therefore slowed the effects of Alzheimer's. Now, they're thinking, wait, maybe metformin is improving Alzheimer's symptoms by directly enhancing brain repair. That it wasn't, right? Like, totally right. It just wasn't that it was slowing the diabetes, and therefore, no, it's actually the thing that's doing it itself. Now they hope to test this metformin, see if it might help repair brains of those who have suffered brain injury due to trauma, or radiation therapies like chemotherapy for cancer. So they're going to take this in a bunch of other directions. But yeah, if you've been on this medication, I'd be really interested to know if you are smarter, do you think, for having taken it?
Well, it's not smarter necessarily, but limiting damage that could be occurring due to
It stimulates the growth of new neurons. I think that equals smarter, or it could potentially if you're using your neurons to collect new information. If you listen to this show, certainly it's made you smarter.
Right.
Well, but then is that the show that's made you smarter? It's really kind of hard to tell sometimes. But I think it is kind of funny how the other studies were sort of illustrating by using this drug that by reducing the symptoms of diabetes, it improved the cognitive abilities of Alzheimer's patients, thinking that reducing that, but it was the drug itself may have been creating new neurons directly. That's pretty sweet. And then the other story is, this is where is this? Scientists at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine have used injections of antibodies to rapidly reverse the onset of type 1 diabetes in mice that were genetically bred to develop the disease. Moreover, just two injections maintain disease remission indefinitely without noticeable harm to the immune system. These findings, published online ahead of print back in late June in the journal Diabetes, suggest for the first time that using a short course of immunotherapy may someday be of value for not reducing the effects of, not limiting the symptoms of, but for reversing the onset of type 1 diabetes in those who are at least recently diagnosed. This form of diabetes, formerly known as insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, is an autoimmune disease in which the body's own immune T cells target and destroy insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. The immune system, which consists of T cells that are required for maintaining immunity against different bacterial viral pathogens, in people who develop the type 1 diabetes, autoreactive T cells that can actively destroy beta cells are not kept in check like they are in healthy people. So they just go out on these killing sprees of perfectly healthy cells, I see, or of insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. Senior study author Roland Tisch, PhD, professor of microbiology and immunology at UNC, said a need for effective immunotherapies also exists to treat type 1 diabetes in people already living with the disease. Clinically, there have been some promising results using so-called depleting antibodies in recently diagnosed type 1 diabetic patients, but the disease process is blocked only for a short period of time, whereas in this recent study, it seems to have, with 2 shots, had no onset later of the disease. Awesomeness.
Amazing. So what was it they injected again?
They injected them with some stuff that was really cool. Antibodies.
Just antibody?
There's probably more details if you actually read the real study, but there was all kinds of long chains of letters and jargon.
Just checking.
As a layman, though, I'm perfectly satisfied with the word antibodies.
And shots.
Insufficient for the cure.
That's really
impressive. But see, now this is one of those things too. This is people who are recently diagnosed. So this is if you don't have a healthcare system in which people are getting screenings for things, this therapy, which can essentially, from at least this one study, cure mice of diabetes, of acquiring it, even though it's genetically in their DNA to get the disease. 2 injections prevents it from onset. The only way you could ever have this as an effective treatment in human beings, if it works in human beings, is to have a healthcare system in which people are being screened and getting regular checkups, and these things are being looked for. Without that, it's not a cure for anything.
Very good point. What are we going to do to cure the problems of the ocean? What are we going to do? We should do something, because according to researchers in publishing in the journal Science, Pacific coral reefs are, the Eastern Pacific coral reefs specifically, are in for some trouble. Tough times. They looked at sedimentary cores going back over several thousand years, and found, basically looking during the Holocene, which is the period since the last ice age. So last ice age and what happened since, looking to see what happened in the Pacific in areas where there are reefs environmentally, and how did the reefs respond. They found that as there were historic changes in the water around 2,500 years ago, 4,000 to 2,500 years ago, the reef communities collapsed. And they think that it had a lot to do with changes in the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And about 4,000 years ago, there's evidence that the El Nino Southern Oscillation began having hiccups, behaving oddly, lasting too long, being too short. Just there was a lot of variation in it that wasn't there. It was a wonderful oscillation that had very regular patterns before this event 4,000 years ago. And what we're seeing now suggests, with increases in temperature and changes to the current El Nino frequencies, we're probably going to see something. They predict that we're going to see trouble for the coral reefs in the Pacific. However, the good news is that even though they were stunted, that they didn't really grow, that they collapsed for over 2,000 years, for about 2,000 years, they did come back. So, maybe we can take measures to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, reduce the temperature of our planet and atmosphere, and potentially the coral reefs will be okay. Maybe additionally that even though they collapse, maybe we can help them come back sooner. So all is not necessarily lost. But these researchers are not optimistic. Not optimistic. Yes. What you got there? Anything else? I have dark matters.
I'll let you get to the dark matter story in a second. This is I'm going to blurb this one out. This is something we've talked about a lot in terms of longevity. The one downside, if we can keep the body living, if we can keep the cognitive mind plastic in its, or the plasticity of the mind to keep learning and being involved in the moment, we could potentially, through science, learn to live for a very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. However, we do so very wrinkly, which we've talked about would have to change the aesthetic of what is beautiful to something in the mid 150s, right? Because we're going to be here a really long time. You only got the smooth skin for a little bit, and then you mature into your long-term body, which would be that of maybe a 90 to 150-year-old is sort of what you'd be able to maintain going forward, getting droopier and droopier in the skin. Until now, in the July 6th issue of Stem Cell, researchers at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine describe how human epidermal progenitor cells and stem cells can control transcription factors to avoid premature differentiation, preserving their ability to produce new skin cells throughout life. In other words, smooth skin longevity. So we may be figuring out that last part of the puzzle for really wanting to go forward with human longevity, which is looking young forever. And even, really this research really could have potentially a great impact on people, even if we only live to be our 80s, 70s to 90s on average, right?
Sure. I mean, there's
any plastic surgery.
There's other research. People are looking into drug delivery through lotions and creams. So why just drug delivery? Why not try and deliver genetic instructions? Why not, reverse engineer our cells through just a little cream that you rub on your skin, and it helps remind your cells that they should renew themselves. I mean,
ancient
that would
science secret.
Yeah. I mean, the company that comes up with that is big bucks. The cream that really does lift and rejuvenate.
Yeah, it says it comes down to approximately 11 proteins responsible for degrading and recycling different RNA elements, such as messenger RNA that wear out or contain errors, resulting in the translation of dysfunctional proteins, which potentially could be deleterious to the cell. In short, says George L. Sen, PhD, assistant professor of medicine, cellular and molecular medicine, the exome functions as a surveillance system in cells to regulate the normal turnover in RNAs, as well as to destroy RNAs with error in them. So, fresh skin forever. Like that makes, then all of a sudden, we wouldn't change the aesthetic of beauty so much. Although I kind of love that idea of like a future with everybody like average middle age is like, 140. Everybody the geriatric future. It'd be brilliant.
Exactly.
But then where would we put all the people? Oh my goodness. Although then again, if we haven't improved our reproductive abilities, we'd have very few people on the planet who could actually reproduce and have a job because people would be staying in their careers for 100 years. Interesting.
Go off planet to do something with your life. But as we're looking off planet, why don't we just talk about dark matter? Because most of everything that's out there is nothing.
Deep.
I know, right?
Hurts my head.
Super deep. Dark matter is stuff we can't see. Fermionic matter is something that we don't know much about. We know that it makes up a large part of our universe. We can't see it. So researchers are trying to find ways to actually learn more about it, to find it, to be able to identify it. The bullet cluster is the one really big piece of visual evidence, observational evidence that we have of dark matter, in that we know that there is a separation as this cluster is being kind of ripped apart, where the mass, the matter, the stuff that we can see that takes up mass, the dust and the galaxies in this bullet cluster are going one way, but light is being bent, the speed of the light is being changed because of the matter that is still being held behind in another place. So there's these two galaxies, they're ripping through each other, and you have a separation of what we can see and what we don't see. And it's a very visual proof. But other than that, we really don't have much proof of it. Can't find it. Don't know where it is. Don't know what it is. So researchers are trying to look many places to get some idea. A new experiment, a researcher from Denmark, Chris Kuvaris, has published an article in Physical Review Letters in which he is looking at neutron stars. And so neutron stars are really big stars that have died, but they're just not massive enough to become black holes. They don't have enough mass to collapse in on themselves and turn into a black hole. If something is massive enough, a star at the end of its life will completely collapse in on itself, form a black hole, suck lots of other stuff in, but the neutron star doesn't do that. If dark matter is collecting around the neutron star, which it probably is, how is that dark matter interacting? And these are the questions that Chris Kuvaris was thinking about when he wrote this paper. And how come that extra dark matter doesn't push the neutron star over the edge and cause it to accumulate enough matter to become a black hole? So by observing neutron stars and other experimental evidence related to neutron stars, he has come up with a bunch of calculations, and his answer is that dark matter doesn't really accumulate very fast. And so what this tells physicists now is it puts specific limits on the activities of these of dark matter particles, the forces that they can have, the masses that they can have, how they would collide with each other, and how they interact. And so it actually adds to the predictions that we can make about how dark matter should behave. Second interesting study that I'm going to talk about very briefly before Justin says something. I don't know. He's laughing there in the back. But second study, really interesting idea, finding dark matter filaments in the web of our universe. So if you look at the galaxy surveys like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, you can see galaxy clusters and these areas. And I've described it before as kind of the universe kind of looking like neurons in a brain. It seems as though the galaxy clusters are like the cell bodies, and that there are these axons of material. But there's stuff, the filaments that connect stuff, the dendrites, the axons, there's stuff missing when you look at it, really. And so people predict that the filaments that hold stuff together they're made up of dark matter. And so the idea is that dark matter forms the pockets, or brings enough matter together in our universe for visible matter to accumulate and to create the galaxies, stars, planets, everything that we have. And so the dark matter basically is supposed to make up the architecture for our universe. So they predicted that they should be able to find evidence of these thin filamentous webs spreading between galaxy clusters. And so they looked at two galaxy clusters, Abell 222 and 223, and compared the distortion and magnification of background galaxies behind and between these two galaxy clusters. And by looking at those distortions and the magnification, they were able to determine the amount of mass that was in the filament that was holding them together. And so basically they use this weak gravitational lensing is the technique that they use to be able to determine it. And they found that normal matter, gas between the clusters, added up to about 5.8 trillion solar masses. And the mass for the filament was about 5.8 quadrillion times the mass of our sun. So this is huge amount of mass. And according to this Ars Technica article, it's enough mass to actually lead to the formation of a galaxy cluster on its own. But that hasn't happened. And so there are very few galaxies within that filamentous region. And so they are putting this out there. The researchers, they published this in Nature this week, that this is direct evidence for the existence of dark matter.
Wow. So in the same week, dark matter and the Higgs boson have been proven.
That's right. That's right. So I think it's just a fascinating study, and the way that they looked at it, they used X-ray frequencies. They used the XMM Newton Space Telescope, looking at X-ray data that had been taken for a few years. And they looked at all sorts of possibilities, trying to explain explain the findings of the data, what they actually got out of it. And they determined that the highest likelihood, most parsimonious result came from the hypothesis that it was a dark matter filament between the galaxy clusters. Yeah. I think it's just, I like dark matter research, and there's so much more to be learned. We know so little about our universe. So little, just tiny little bit. We're just making up these little stories and going, does that work? Does that work? This time, yes. So far, it does. But we have reached the end of our hour, haven't we? The end of another hour of science.
We have. That brings us to a conclusion. An end, if you will, of another episode.
Right. We're going to be back here on twit.tv next week. So you can watch us live next week on twit.tv. Beyond that, I will let people know where we will be in future weeks if you want to watch us live. But fear not, TWiS will continue. Shout outs to everyone who has sent in words of support and donations. Really, the amount of communication that the TWiS minions have been sending in, it's just mind-boggling and heartwarming, and thank you so much. Shout outs to you all.
Absolutely, and thank you again for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. TWiS is, as always, available as a podcast. Just Google This Week in Science in the iTunes directory, or if you have an Android device, you can look for TWiS for Droid, that's TWiS, the number 4 Droid app in the Android marketplace, and we are also TWiS, TWiS, in the iPhone marketplace.
That's right. And for more information on anything that you've heard here today, show notes are going to be available on our website, thanks to the lovely and talented Blair. And we love your feedback. And if there's a topic that you want us to cover or address, you can post comments on the website, or you can send us an email, Kirsten@thisweekinscience.com or Justin@thisweekinscience.com.
Be sure to put TWiS, TWiS, somewhere in the subject line, or your email will be spam filtered into oblivion. Or you can just contact us at Twitter, at Dr. Kiki, at Jacksonfly, at Blair's Menagerie. We love your feedback. If there was a topic you would like us to cover or address, a suggestion for an interview, an idea of where to put Science Island, please let us know.
And we'll be back here next week, like we said before, and we hope that you will join us once again for more great science-y goodness.
And if you've learned anything from today's show, remember,
it's all in your head.
This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science, it's the end of the world. So I'm setting up shop, got my banner unfurled. It says the scientist is in, I'm gonna sell my advice. Show them how to stop the robots with a simple device. I'll reverse global warming with a wave of my hand. And all it'll cost you is a couple of grand. 'Cause this week's science is coming your way. So everybody listen to what I say. I use the scientific method for all that it's worth, and I'll broadcast my opinion all over the earth. 'Cause it's This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. 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 This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. 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 I've got one disclaimer, and it shouldn't be news, that what I say may not represent your views, but I've done the calculations and I've got a plan. If you listen to the science, you may just yet understand that we're not trying to threaten your philosophy. We're just trying to save the world from jeopardy. And this week in science is coming your way. So everybody listen to everything we say. And if you use our method instead of rolling a die, we may rid the world of toxoplasma gondii. Cause it's This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. Science. I've got a laundry list of items I want to address. From stopping global hunger to dredging Loch Ness. I'm trying to promote more rational thought, and I'll try to answer any question you've got. So how can I ever see the changes I seek when I can only set up shop 1 hour a week? This Week in Science is coming your way. You better just listen to what we say. And if you've learned anything from the words that we've said, then please just remember it's all in your head. Cause it's This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. Science.